It was Thanksgiving. I stood on the porch with my homemade pumpkin pie smiling. I had raised my son David with nothing but thread, scissors, and love. I'd given him everything. So when I received the invitation to his family's Thanksgiving dinner, my heart danced. But when the door creaked open, it wasn't joy that greeted me. It was Charlotte, his wife. Her cold eyes scanned me and her lips curled. "This dinner is for close family only," she whispered, loud enough for the guests inside to hear. The door shut. My pie dropped. My heart cracked. What had I done to deserve this? I was his mother. I gave him life, stitched his childhood back together more times than I could count. But standing in that cold wind, I realized something else. They didn't just forget me, they planned to erase me, and that was their biggest mistake. Margaret Elliott had spent the entire morning brushing the dust off her best wool coat. It wasn't new, far from it, but it held warmth in every fiber. It had seen winters, funerals, and one or two small victories. She folded a simple white scarf around her neck and took one last look in the hallway mirror. Her eyes, framed by crow's feet and years of patience, held a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Anticipation. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down the fabric. On the kitchen counter, a glass casserole dish sat covered in foil. Her famous green bean casserole. She had been making it every Thanksgiving since David was in kindergarten, even during the lean years when green beans came from dented cans and onions had to be diced by hand. The invitation had arrived 3 days earlier in her inbox. Short, polite, formal. "We'd love to have you for Thanksgiving this year. Dinner at 6 p.m. Dress nice, David." Just that. No love, no mom, no looking forward to seeing you. But it was more than she had gotten in years. That was enough. Margaret picked up the casserole and headed to the garage where her aging Ford waited. The back seat still had David's old baseball glove, sun-bleached and cracked, tucked behind the seat, a remnant of childhoods that seemed both far away and freshly vivid. She started the car and backed out of her modest driveway, the neighborhood already quiet for the holiday. As she drove, snowflakes began to fall, catching in the corners of her windshield. Traffic was light. The streets in David's part of town were wider, smoother, cleaner. Gated communities with mailboxes shaped like stone lanterns. She had been here only once before, 2 years ago, when David moved in. Even then, she hadn't been invited inside. Charlotte had come out to say David was running late and suggested they reschedule. They never did. Still, Margaret kept her hopes up. Maybe things were different now. Maybe David missed her. Maybe Charlotte had softened. People change, she told herself. Time heals. And hadn't she given them space like they asked? After all, she didn't want to be one of those mothers who hovered or interfered. She respected their independence, but she'd never stopped hoping for a place at their table again. The heater hummed, warming her legs as she turned the corner onto Sycamore Lane. The houses here were palatial, trimmed with wreaths, candles in windows, and blinking lights perfectly synchronized. It looked like a magazine cover. She pulled into the driveway and parked behind a black Lexus. Through the massive windows, she could see shadows moving inside, guests mingling, a fire roaring, glasses raised, laughter spilled faintly through the glass. Margaret's heart lifted. Her son was inside, her family. Maybe she'd been wrong to doubt. She balanced the casserole in one arm and walked carefully up the flagstone path. The door was oak, heavy and polished, adorned with a gold monogrammed G, Charlotte's maiden name. Margaret rang the bell and took a breath. Footsteps approached. The door opened. Charlotte stood there, sleek in a dark green dress, a wine glass in one hand. Her eyes scanned Margaret from head to toe, coat, scarf, casserole, and paused at the loafers worn slightly at the toes. "Oh," she said flatly, "you came." Margaret blinked. "Yes, I got David's email. I brought the casserole, green bean, like always." Charlotte tilted her head, smiled thinly. "Right." She didn't move to take the dish, didn't step aside. Behind her, music played softly, and someone laughed at a joke Margaret would never hear. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Charlotte said, her voice low but clear. "Tonight's dinner is very private. Just a few close friends and family." Margaret frowned. "But I'm David's mother." Charlotte's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, but this is a bit Curated, you understand, the Greystones, my father's associates, they're particular about image. Margaret felt her arms grow heavy. The casserole dish began to slip in her hands. She clutched it tighter. David invited me, she said more quietly now. Charlotte raised her eyebrows. Did he? Or maybe it was a typo. Emails can be tricky. The door didn't slam. That might have been kinder. Instead, it closed slowly, deliberately, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing in the quiet night air. Margaret stood there, pie dish in hand, heart pounding. She could feel the warmth of the house behind the door, the fire, the laughter, the smell of turkey and sage. But outside, the cold nipped at her cheeks. She turned slowly and walked back to her car. No tears fell. Not yet. But as she opened the door, set the casserole beside her, and sank into the driver's seat, one thought cut through the noise in her mind. I gave him everything, every bit of myself, and he chose this. The engine idled quietly as Margaret sat frozen in her seat. Snow dusted the windshield and her breath fogged the glass, leaving tiny patches of moisture that blurred the view. She glanced down at the casserole dish on the passenger seat. The foil had come loose at the corner. A few green beans peeked through like they too were stunned by the sudden cold. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, unmoving. The porch light of David's home glowed behind her, illuminating the driveway, casting long shadows of her car across the flawless concrete. The contrast between the warmth inside that house and the chill in her chest was unbearable. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to drive away. She fumbled in her coat pocket for her phone. Maybe there had been a mistake. She needed to check. Her fingers, stiff with cold and emotion, finally managed to unlock the screen. She opened the email David had sent. She'd read it so many times in the past few days, she could recite it by heart. But now, she looked more closely. The subject line, Thanksgiving dinner, group invite. Group, she clicked details. Her heart sank. The email had been CC'd to over 20 recipients. Most were names she didn't recognize. Likely business partners, Charlotte's friends, maybe even caterers. It wasn't a personal invitation. It wasn't even directed at her. And the name in the salutation? Hi team, looking forward to seeing everyone Thursday at 6. Not hi mom, not even Margaret. This wasn't meant for her at all. A slow, dawning understanding swept over her. The warmth she'd felt these past 3 days, the cautious hope, the belief that maybe, finally she'd been remembered, had all been built on a clerical error. She hadn't been invited. She wasn't supposed to be there. Charlotte's expression made sense now. Not hostility, just annoyance at a disruption. An unexpected guest crashing a scene too carefully curated to include someone like her. David's silence, his eyes refusing to meet hers, were not shame. They were apathy, the kind that cuts deeper than cruelty. The shock gave way to a burn, hot and sharp, just behind her ribs. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. She remembered the first Thanksgiving after her husband died. David had been 6. She worked 2 jobs then, alterations during the day, stocking shelves at night. Still, she had made a small dinner. Turkey legs, mashed potatoes, a tiny store-bought pie. David had climbed into her lap after dessert and whispered, I'm thankful for you, Mama. You're my whole team. She swallowed hard. When had I stopped being his team? The street around her was quiet. The laughter from the house still trickled faintly through the walls, muffled by insulation and privilege. No one had followed her out. No one noticed she was gone. No one cared. She reached over, adjusted the foil on the casserole, smoothed it down with careful precision. Then she placed it on her lap, unsure what to do with it. Throw it away? Drop it on their doorstep like a protest? She shook her head. No, that wasn't her way. Instead, she took one more look at the house, the grand windows, the string lights, the illusion of a perfect family holiday, and then put the car in reverse. The tires crunched against the light snowfall as she backed out of the driveway. The drive home felt longer. She passed houses where families gathered around tables, where silhouettes danced behind curtains, where the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled the air. She passed warmth, past joy, past the illusion she had clung to. When she turned onto her street, the snow was heavier. Her little home, tucked between a retired teacher and a widowed veteran, looked small but peaceful. The porch light had turned off automatically at dusk. She flipped it back on as she entered, carrying the untouched casserole like a relic from a world she no longer belonged to. She placed it gently on the counter, unwrapped the foil. The green beans had steamed slightly in the car. A layer of crispy onions softened at the edges. She turned off the oven. There would be no dinner. Margaret walked slowly to her armchair, the one by the fireplace, wrapped herself in the same quilt she'd used since David was a boy, and sat. Not to cry, she didn't have the energy for that yet. Instead, she reached for her knitting basket. Her fingers knew the motion, even if her heart felt hollow. Loop, pull, tighten, loop, pull, tighten. The silence in the house grew thicker, but her hands kept moving. And slowly, between stitches, came the thought she hadn't let herself face until now. This wasn't just about tonight. It hadn't been for years. The quick phone calls, the polite deferrals, the birthdays celebrated with delayed texts, the holidays spent traveling. They all stacked together into a quiet truth she hadn't wanted to name. She had become inconvenient. Not hated, not despised, just unacknowledged. And that somehow was worse. The doorbell didn't ring. The phone didn't buzz. No second invitation came. And still Margaret sat in her chair, knitting, her eyes dry but distant. At exactly 7:45 p.m., she looked at the digital clock glowing on her mantel. Then she whispered aloud, not to anyone but herself, "I wasn't even meant to be there." And this time, she felt it, the truth, and the cut it left behind. The next morning, Margaret awoke to silence, the kind that presses against the walls of the house like fog, thick, unspoken, unsettled. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the sky remained gray, and the air held that strange stillness only found after something has been broken. She made her way to the kitchen, her knees aching slightly, as they always did in the winter. The green bean casserole sat untouched on the counter, still covered, still hopeful. Margaret gently picked it up and placed it in the fridge. Old habits died hard. She poured herself a cup of tea and wrapped both hands around the mug for warmth. Through the kitchen window, she watched as a squirrel darted across the yard and disappeared beneath the hedge. The world had moved on, but she hadn't, not yet. After finishing her tea, she decided to step outside for the morning paper. Her boots crunched softly in the snow as she walked down the front steps, pulling her cardigan tight against the breeze. The mailbox at the end of the walk looked odd, crooked. She stopped in her tracks. The black metal post leaned slightly to one side, the door hanging open like a yawning mouth. Her breath caught in her throat. As she got closer, the damage became clearer. The side panel was dented in, deep and deliberate. Paint was scratched, not in swirls of weathering or accidental scrapes, but in sharp, aggressive lines. The latch had been twisted. It hadn't been the wind, or time, or rust. This was vandalism. Margaret knelt down carefully, her knees pressing into the cold concrete. The snow around the base had been disturbed. Boot prints, not quite fresh, but not yet melted. She measured them with her eyes. Size 10, 11, adult, not a child's prank. She glanced over her shoulder at the quiet street. No one was outside. The veteran next door had his blinds drawn, and the retiree on the other side was likely still asleep. It was just her in the mailbox. She straightened, heart thudding louder than it should have. Why would someone do this? She wasn't the kind of neighbor who made enemies. She returned tools, watered her roses, kept her lawn tidy. Even the mailman waved every morning. There was no reason for someone to damage her property, unless... A flicker of suspicion. No, she thought, that's too far-fetched, but the timing, last night. The door shut in her face, the cold dismissal, the shame. Could it be connected? Her mind played the scene back again, the way Charlotte's eyes had narrowed, the way David hadn't even spoken, hadn't even looked at her. There was something rehearsed about the way Charlotte handled it, something too precise, too calculated. Could someone, Charlotte even, have sent someone to make a point? Was this their way of making sure she got the message? Stay away. You're not welcome. You're not part of the image. The thought chilled her more than the snow. She took a shaky breath and returned to the house. The mailbox would have to wait. She sat at the kitchen table, her tea now cold, and stared at the tabletop as if the wood grain might offer answers. A knock at the door jolted her. Margaret froze. She waited a moment, half hoping it had been her imagination. But the knock came again, softer this time, cautious. She stood, cautiously walked to the door, and opened it just a crack. A young man stood on the porch, his breath visible in the air, holding a clipboard. "Morning, ma'am. Sorry to bother you, just checking in about the neighborhood crime watch. We've had a few reports of minor vandalism recently." Margaret blinked. "What kind?" "Mostly mailboxes. Some Christmas decorations damaged, nothing serious. Just thought you should know." She nodded, her suspicion deepening. "Thank you." He handed her a flyer and left. As she closed the door, her eyes lingered on the paper. "Protect your property. Report any suspicious activity immediately." Suspicious. Yes, something was suspicious. But it wasn't the neighborhood kids. It was the look in Charlotte's eyes. It was the way the door closed, not slammed, but sealed. It was the silence from David. It was the crooked mailbox. Margaret folded the flyer neatly and set it on the counter. She wasn't sure what was happening yet, but she knew it wasn't random, and it wasn't over. That afternoon, Margaret sat curled on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a mug of reheated tea warming her hands. The flyer from the neighborhood watch sat on the table in front of her, next to the newspaper she hadn't opened. Her knitting sat untouched beside her. The stitches no longer distracted her. She kept thinking about the mailbox, the boot prints, the look in Charlotte's eyes, the missing invitation. And beneath it all, a gnawing suspicion she couldn't shake. She hadn't just been forgotten, she'd been erased. At 3:12 p.m., the phone rang. She hesitated before answering. Most calls were spam these days. She considered letting it go to voicemail, but something told her to pick it up. "Hello? Mom?" Her grip tightened around the receiver. David. His voice was warm, too warm, polished, the kind of tone he used when asking for money in college, or when smoothing things over after missing her birthday 3 years in a row. "David," she said cautiously. "Hey, I wanted to call about last night." Margaret waited, heart thudding. Was he going to apologize? "I'm sorry," he continued. "There was some confusion with the invitations. Charlotte thought she had updated the list. I didn't realize you'd been sent the preliminary version." Her mouth went dry. Preliminary version? Like she was a placeholder. "I stood on your doorstep," she said evenly. "With your childhood casserole. Charlotte told me it was a private dinner." A pause. "Yeah, that wasn't right. She shouldn't have done that." "And you said nothing." Another pause. David exhaled. "Look, Mom, I know it must have felt bad. That's why I'm calling. Charlotte and I talked, and we'd love for you to come to the actual Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow, the family dinner." Margaret furrowed her brow. "Tomorrow?" "Yes, it's more intimate, just us, Charlotte's dad, a few business partners, but we want you there." He emphasized the word want, as if trying to overwrite everything that came before. "You want me there now?" she asked. "We do. Charlotte feels terrible, and it would mean a lot to have you join us. Dinner's at 6 again. Wear something nice, okay?" Margaret didn't answer right away. Her instincts screamed caution. His voice, smooth and overly sweet, didn't match the man who'd avoided her eyes the night before. And Charlotte felt terrible? Since when? Still, something inside her stirred, a desperate, aching hope. Was this a chance to reclaim her place at the table? To remind David where he came from? "All right," she said finally. "I'll come." "Great, see you then." He hung up without a goodbye. Margaret stood in her quiet kitchen, holding the phone to her ear long after the line went dead. That evening, Margaret prepared for the next day. She took out her best dress, a dark blue one she hadn't worn since her husband's funeral, and hung it near the heater to soften the creases. She ironed her blouse, polished her low-heeled shoes. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she would walk in with her head high. As she folded a linen napkin to test a new centerpiece idea, she caught her reflection in the window. Tired, yes, but proud. Her hair was grayer than she remembered, and her hands bore the marks of years of stitching and scrubbing. Still, there was grace in her bones. She didn't see herself as fragile, but she did feel exposed, and something about David's invitation didn't sit right. That night, Margaret sat at her desk to write a note of thanks to a neighbor who had dropped off cookies earlier in the week. When she opened her email to check the neighbor's address, her inbox still displayed the message from David, the one she had reread too many times. She clicked it again. Subject: Thanksgiving dinner, group invite. She scrolled to the bottom, sent by Charlotte Greystone via shared access. That was new, she hadn't noticed it before. Charlotte had sent the email, not David. She hovered over the sender. Charlotte had BCC'd the list, no recipients visible, but the via shared access note made her stomach tighten. Charlotte had used David's email account. Margaret's chest hollowed. This hadn't been a mistake. It had been a setup, a scene, an opportunity. And now, after the door had been shut in her face, they were calling her back, just in time for the real dinner. What had changed? Charlotte's father, Edward Greystone, a name Margaret had heard before. A real estate mogul, silent investor in several hospitals and schools, publicly stern, privately ruthless. Charlotte had always wanted to impress him. Margaret remembered the wedding speech, how Charlotte thanked her father for his values of excellence and vision, while David barely got a passing mention. Edward had always been the prize, and Margaret, she was disposable. Unless she wasn't. Unless her humiliation had been useful. She imagined Charlotte describing it to her father. Poor David's mother, so simple, so sweet, showed up uninvited, so pitiful, but we handled it with grace. A show of social refinement, a contrast, a performance. And tomorrow? Tomorrow they'd bring her back in, to complete the story, to complete the illusion. Margaret stared at the email one last time, her throat dry. They didn't invite her to reconcile, they invited her to perform. But what they didn't know was that she had already stepped out of that role. She wasn't just going to show up, she was going to pay attention. And maybe, just maybe, she'd play a little role of her own. Margaret arrived 15 minutes early, just as the first wave of twilight began to fade into the darker hush of evening. The Greystone estate stood tall and glittering like something out of a winter postcard. The warmth of the house was visible through tall windows, the shimmer of crystal glassware, the golden chandelier casting halos of light across polished wood floors, the silhouettes of well-dressed guests moving like shadows in a play. She gripped her modest clutch tightly and straightened the lapels of her navy coat. Her old shoes were buffed, and the scent of lavender clung faintly to her scarf. She had braided her silver hair into a loose twist, the same way she used to when attending church potlucks. Nothing about her screamed high society, but everything about her was real. She walked slowly toward the grand entrance, past expensive cars and trimmed hedges. As she reached the stone steps, she heard a voice, David's, laughing just inside the entry hall. She paused. The door was ajar. She wasn't sure why she didn't announce herself. Maybe it was instinct, maybe caution, or maybe something deeper warned her. Don't let them see you yet. She moved closer to the crack in the door and leaned in, just slightly. Inside, David stood near the staircase, adjusting his cufflinks. Charlotte hovered nearby, checking her reflection in the glass of a display case. She's really coming? Charlotte asked, tone amused. David smirked. She confirmed this morning, told me she'd wear that navy dress again, the one from Dad's funeral. Charlotte let out a breathy laugh. Perfect, just perfect, the sad, forgotten widow. Honestly, this couldn't be better. Margaret's spine stiffened, her breath caught. David chuckled. She's gonna be so out of place tonight. You should see the wine list alone. Peter Greystone picked every bottle himself. I've got it all planned, Charlotte said, her voice sharper now, rehearsed. During my toast, I'll introduce her as our former housekeeper from the old neighborhood. Say we invited her out of kindness, as a reminder of our humble roots, something the Greystone board eats up. David laughed louder. That'll crush. They'll love the charity angle. And sympathy, Charlotte added. Daddy will eat it up. He loves a good redemption arc. Sad mother, grateful son, generous daughter-in-law. It'll hit every emotional button. She won't even realize it's happening, David said. Charlotte smiled. She never does. A beat of silence, then Charlotte added softer. Honestly, it's pathetic. She still thinks she's family. David sighed. She used to be useful, back when I needed tuition. Now, he shrugged. She's just this emotional liability. Margaret stepped back, breath shallow. Her feet, suddenly heavy, felt rooted to the stone. The cold from the marble porch crept into her bones, spreading like frostbite. She turned away before they could spot her shadow and made her way back to the garden path, gripping the iron railing as if to steady the storm in her chest. Tears didn't come immediately. They couldn't. There was no room for them, only the sharp realization that every hug, every polite text, every delayed birthday call, it had all been part of a role she was cast to play. And now she wasn't even playing the mother. She was playing the maid, a relic, a prop. Inside, she heard the clinking of glasses. The guests were gathering. The show was about to begin. Margaret walked toward the side of the house, eyes burning. She needed a moment to breathe, to think. The cold air slapped her cheeks, a jarring contrast to the heat boiling beneath her ribs. She spotted a row of hedges bordering the kitchen entrance and took shelter behind them, hidden from the grand entrance. From this angle, she had a clear view into the catering prep area through a half-open side window. Inside, the bustle of staff was in full motion, servers arranging hors d'oeuvres, waiters in crisp black carrying trays of champagne. The head caterer was barking instructions while a young assistant adjusted place cards at the long dining table visible through the archway. At the center of it all stood Charlotte, her cocktail dress a deep emerald that shimmered under the chandelier. She held a note card in one hand and was quietly rehearsing her speech to a server. "And tonight," she said with a practiced smile, "we're especially honored to have someone very dear to us, our former housekeeper from David's childhood neighborhood, who's here with us tonight as a reminder that kindness always finds its way home." She smiled wider. "Doesn't that sound perfect?" The server nodded awkwardly. Charlotte turned to the dining room, positioning herself before the centerpiece. She doesn't have much family, and it just felt right, you know? Inviting her. Opening our hearts. Margaret's heart twisted. So this was it. Not just a lie, a public performance, a moral statement. One that painted her history into something ornamental and pitiful. Something consumable. She wasn't invited to belong. She was invited to inspire pity. And applause. A sudden sharp wind sliced through the hedges and made Margaret pull her coat tighter. But her mind had already moved past the sting. If this was their show, she thought, then maybe it was time she rewrote the ending. Not for them, but for herself. Margaret didn't cry. Not a single tear slipped past her lashes as she turned away from the glittering facade of the Greystone estate. The truth of what she had heard lingered like smoke in her chest, suffocating but clarifying. It burned away any illusion she might have clung to. Her son, her own flesh and blood, had reduced her to a theatrical tool, and Charlotte, sharp, calculating Charlotte, had choreographed it all with surgical precision. No, Margaret didn't cry. She walked, quietly, with purpose. By the time she reached the end of the winding drive, her fingers were already dialing a number she hadn't used in over 5 years. "Nancy Bloom," came the voice on the other end, brisk, polished, professional. "It's Margaret," she said. There was a beat, then a warm chuckle. "Margaret Bennett? My God, it's been forever. I thought you disappeared into the mountains with your cat and a pile of books." "I did," Margaret said, "but now I'm back." Nancy's voice softened. "What's wrong?" "I need your help," Margaret said simply. "Of course. Anything." There was no hesitation. That was the kind of woman Nancy was. Loyal to the core, razor smart, and, as fate would have it, the current director of public relations for the Edward Group, the parent company of Greystone Holdings. "I'm at the Greystone estate," Margaret said, her voice even. "David's engagement party, or rather Charlotte's show." "Oh," Nancy paused. "I've heard of her. Peter Greystone's prodigy. Married into the boardroom." "Yes, except she's not married yet." Nancy let out a breath. "What happened?" Margaret told her everything. The staged narrative, the lie about her being a housekeeper, the fake smile Charlotte wore while planning to humiliate her for sympathy applause. Nancy was quiet for a moment, processing. "She's good," Nancy finally said. "Too good." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "I've seen her play this game before. PR warfare. She's done it inside our boardroom more than once. Last year, she leaked selective footage of a senior partner during a charity gala, claimed he made inappropriate comments. She had the timing down perfectly, got him booted just in time for a new board vote." Margaret clenched her jaw. "She ruins people. She packages their downfalls," Nancy said. "It's cleaner that way." "Then help me unpack her," Margaret said. A pause. "You want to go public?" "No," Margaret said. "I want to go precise, tonight, during her speech." Nancy let out a slow whistle. "You've got backbone. All right, I'll play. What do you need from me?" Tell me what evidence you have, anything that might dent her perfect veneer. Margaret thought fast. I have an email trail from last month. She asked me to sign a vendor agreement for flower delivery, said it was routine. The signature block was blank when I received it. But what I saw later, when a copy came to my inbox, it included renovation permits, zoning authorization. She used my name to file construction updates under my property rights. Nancy inhaled sharply. That's forgery and corporate overreach. She wanted the upgrades approved in time for Peter Greystone's next board meeting, Margaret added. I think she's trying to position herself as next in line for his legacy, the estate, the influence, everything. Nancy was already typing. Send me the documents, email or photos. Margaret pulled her phone from her coat pocket. She had scanned the files earlier out of habit. She forwarded them in silence. Got it, Nancy said a moment later. This will do. What's the plan? Nancy chuckled. You'll like it. During the toast, Charlotte always requests a live stream. It's her favorite trick for controlling narrative. We'll hack the stream, not illegally, just redirect it. To what? To a very tasteful slide, Nancy said. Title, Legacy and Legality, Questions of Ownership in the Greystone Household. Margaret's lips curled. Subtle. Elegant, Nancy corrected. Just enough for people to whisper, for board members to raise brows, for Peter to reconsider. Will it ruin her? No, Nancy said, but it will corner her. A woman like Charlotte survives on perception. You shake that even a little, and the cracks spread fast. Margaret felt her pulse calm, steady. I don't want revenge, she said. Then what do you want? I want her to feel what it's like to be reduced to a footnote, Margaret said. Just once. Then she can rewrite her story however she likes. Nancy was quiet for a second. You always were the most dangerous kind of woman, Margaret. Why's that? You never had to scream to be heard. Margaret smiled faintly. And you always knew how to listen. They ended the call. Margaret stood beneath a willow tree near the perimeter of the garden, her coat pulled tight against the wind. She checked her phone. 8:11 p.m. Charlotte's speech was scheduled for 8:30. She could already see guests being ushered into the main hall. She slipped in through the side entrance unnoticed and found her assigned seat, back row next to the catering door. Exactly as planned. Let the lights shine on them. Tonight, Margaret would be their shadow. Margaret waited in the lobby of Edward Group's headquarters, a sleek glass and chrome building that reflected the surrounding skyline like a polished diamond. She'd never expected to be here, and yet, here she was, standing beneath corporate logos and the hum of quiet urgency. The elevator ride up felt longer than it was. Her heart thumped steadily, not from fear but from resolve. Nancy had arranged the meeting without warning Charlotte. Ruth. Margaret smirked at her own new name, not yet legal but fully claimed now. She hadn't rehearsed what she wanted to say. She would speak plainly. The door opened to a minimalist office. Edward Greystone sat behind a wide desk framed by panoramic windows overlooking the city. He was a man molded by legacy, old money, old power. His expression was polite but distant. He motioned to a chair. Margaret sat. Without preamble, Edward leaned forward. Ms. Bennett, I understand you requested this meeting. She nodded. Thank you for seeing me. He gave a slight, neutral nod. Margaret unfolded the summary Nancy had prepared and placed it carefully on the desk before him. This is what I know. How I was presented as a former housekeeper at my own son's engagement party. That Charlotte orchestrated a staged narrative at my expense. That she used my signature without consent to initiate renovations. And that she planned to purchase my property after the wedding. Edward tapped the papers gently. The company is aware of some changes on the estate. She continued, I want recognition. I want my rights honored and my name acknowledged. She paused, meeting Edward's eyes, morally and legally. He looked down at the document, thumbed it slowly, then raised his gaze. I will be present at the event. Please, Margaret said softly, not as a guest, as a witness. Edward leaned back. Understood. Margaret exhaled, bracing herself for a rebound, an objection or a conditional refusal. But there was none. Instead, he stood and offered a handshake. She accepted. No reassurance, no praise, no apology, just the promise of presence. Margaret left his office quietly, sunshine paling against her determination. Alone again. She didn't cry, she didn't celebrate. She walked back through the lobby, now feeling the weight of her own power, quiet, unyielding. That evening, she returned to Greystone Estate. The air had cooled. Lanterns glowed faintly. Guests murmured in clusters. Waiters glided across gravel pathways, offering champagne and trays of hors d'oeuvres. The celebration was moving toward the grand hall. Inside, Charlotte mingled, her smile effortless. She nodded at Margaret's way only once before moving on, redirecting her attention to donors and board members. Margaret watched her carefully, emotion tamped down. At precisely 8:30, Charlotte paused by a marble column near the entrance, glass in hand. She cleared her throat and raised her voice, addressing those gathered near the stage. I want to thank everyone for being here. Tonight is about family, legacy, and new beginnings. A soft laugh. I also want to acknowledge those who shaped this journey before me. Margaret felt a small tightening in her chest. Charlotte continued, while my team is stepping into this new chapter, I also want to honor the foundations that supported us. She surveyed the room, gaze sweeping past Margaret, grazing the window. She said nothing more. Margaret sat in the crowd quietly. The floor was cool beneath her dress. The attention lavished on Charlotte was immense. Polished speeches, coordinated applause. She waited. The music paused. Light tilted. A hush fell. Then a soft chime and the projected screen lit up unexpectedly. A slide appeared. Legacy and legality. Questions of ownership in the Greystone household. The title shimmered with the same sleek aesthetic as the venue. Guests shifted, looking at phones and whispers cascading. Charlotte froze mid-sentence. Her carefully composed face flickered. Margaret's phone chimed, a message from Nancy. He will be here. Edward stepped into view. Not in uniform, not as a guest, but he walked onto the stage beside Charlotte, catching attention. She faltered, her toast abandoned. He took the microphone. I'd like to clarify, he said, direct but composed, that Cedar Hollow Estate, while appreciated and cherished, has never been transferred from its sole owner, Ms. Margaret Eleanor Bennett. The room went silent. Guests exchanged glances. Charlotte's mouth tightened. Edward continued. We move forward tonight based on respect for present owners and legacy. I've also requested an updated invitation to include her name formally. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Charlotte opened her mouth, closed it. Edward stepped away, leaving a stunned hush in his wake. Margaret exhaled. Inside, the gutted cord of Charlotte's smile cracked first, then curled into something else. Realization, alarm, vulnerability. Margaret rose slowly from her seat. She walked toward the edge of the stage and took a drink of water. She looked out at the guests. No applause came. She said nothing. But that silence struck harder than any accusation. Charlotte's carefully curated performance had unraveled, not with fury, but with stillness, not with trial, but with truth. Margaret returned to her seat. The moment passed. Dinner resumed. Toasts continued, but the tone had shifted. This time, Margaret wasn't the background. She was the pivot, and the house that had once been refashioned for a perfect illusion now held the weight of authenticity. Margaret spent the next day preparing her home the way she always had before things began to fall apart. No grand gestures, no caterers or decorators, just her in a quiet kitchen filled with the scent of rosemary, honey, and roasted root vegetables. A tablecloth freshly pressed, silver polished by hand. Candles, not extravagant but real wax, and white linen napkins folded the way Harold used to prefer. She moved with a grace carved out of repetition. These rituals were her own form of prayer. A quiet rebellion against the glossy, artificial world she had been dragged into. She didn't know if anyone would show up. She didn't ask, but she cooked. By 3 p.m., the house smelled like memory. By 4:30, the sun had dipped just behind the edge of the pine trees that flanked the lake. Shadows stretched along the deck. Margaret adjusted the table again, checked the wine glasses, lit one of the tall candles early just to test the way the wax would pool. She stood for a moment by the window, arms crossed, watching the road through a narrow gap in the trees. Nothing. 5:10. No cars. 5:30. Still no sign. Her heart beat a little faster, not in panic, but in the aching space where hope often lived. Maybe she had imagined it all. Maybe Edward's speech would stay as nothing more than a quiet footnote in an otherwise immaculate evening. Maybe Charlotte would sweep it away with a well-timed quote or a curated apology. But at 5:45, headlights sliced through the fading light. Margaret stepped back from the window. The car pulled in, long, deep gray chrome trim that gleamed like a threat. A Bentley, not Edward's. The engine cut, the door opened. A man stepped out in a charcoal suit, slim briefcase in one hand, a notepad tucked beneath his arm. His shoes crunched on the gravel path as he approached. He didn't glance around. He walked with purpose. Margaret opened the door before he could knock. He offered a warm, professional smile. "Ms. Bennett?" She nodded. "You're early." "Habit," he said. "May I?" She motioned him inside. He stepped over the threshold, eyes scanning the interior. Not judgmentally, but with curiosity. "You've made it very warm," he said, "unusual for homes that have been, shall we say, commandeered by corporate families." "I take pride in preservation," she replied. He nodded. "As do I." They sat at the table, though she did not serve food, not yet. "I'm Alan Prescott," he said, "senior correspondent for the New York Herald. Nancy Bloom invited me. Said this story needed eyes that don't blink too easily." Margaret blinked. "This isn't a media stunt." "It won't be," he assured her. "But Charlotte Greystone is on the shortlist for a future political appointment. Her role in corporate restructuring, her social engagement portfolio, it's building a path. What Nancy discovered and what you've lived through could shift that narrative." Margaret considered him carefully. "And what would that do for me?" He didn't flinch. "Likely nothing." She appreciated the honesty. "But," he continued, "it may stop her from hurting the next woman who doesn't have a publicist." Margaret leaned back in her chair. She looked at the candle now flickering stronger as the room dimmed. "Ask your questions." He didn't press record, just took notes, asked about the wedding, about the party, about the fake narrative, the forged signatures, the contractor quotes Charlotte approved under Margaret's name. "How long have you owned this home?" he asked. 34 years, she said. "Built it with my husband. Lived in it longer than I've lived anywhere." "And you were called the housekeeper?" "I was called convenient." He looked up. She didn't smile. By the time the conversation wound down, night had fallen. No other guests arrived. That part Margaret expected. Alan stood, gently sliding his notebook into his case. "You said this isn't a stunt," he said, "so I won't publish until you're ready. But you should know Charlotte's prior tactics with the board, they're already under review. An ethics committee in D.C. is asking questions." Margaret nodded. "I don't need her destroyed." "No," he agreed, "just revealed." He paused at the door. "You know," he added, "there's something elegant about the way you've done this. You didn't march or shout. You didn't crash the party. You just told the truth in the right room." Margaret smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's all it takes." He left. The night air rushed in briefly before she closed the door behind him. She walked to the kitchen and poured herself a cup of tea. No wine, not tonight. She carried it to the porch, wrapped herself in the shawl she'd worn on her wedding day. The stars above the lake were sharper now, unbothered by what people chose to forget or pretend. No one else came, but the story had, and that would be enough. The reception was in full swing. Lanterns dangled between pine branches, golden light dancing over white-clothed tables. A quartet played softly near the entrance. The guests, clad in cocktail dresses and tailored suits, milled around, drinks in hand, laughter light and confident. In that moment, everything looked perfect from the outside. Charlotte stood at the head of the main table, flushed with pride. She raised her glass, eyes sparkling with practiced enthusiasm. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice clear and polished. "This evening is a celebration, a merging of families and futures. I'm honored to share with you the legacy of Greystone Holdings and the legacy of my family, with whom I'll build something even greater." She clinked her glass. Somewhere in the audience, champagne bubbled, people nodded. At her side, Matthew sat with a stiff smile. Ruth, Margaret, sat 3 rows back, a faint tightening in her chest as Charlotte spoke. "Tonight," Charlotte continued, "I also want to acknowledge those who have supported us from the very beginning. Those whose sacrifices built the foundation upon which Greystone thrives. A pause. Her gaze shifted slightly, but she didn't meet Margaret's eyes. Margaret was gracious enough to join us. Ruth sat taller. But let me simply say she has supported us unofficially through acts of kindness and maternal care, though she's never taken the spotlight. A phrase echoed in Ruth's mind. Mother by kindness. Charlotte smiled, warm and controlled. So please join me in raising a toast to the woman who quietly cared for her son and never asked for applause. A ripple of polite applause followed. Ruth's heart throbbed with something between indignation and sorrow. No one called her the groom's mother. No one spoke of her role in building that life. Just unspoken acknowledgement and enforced invisibility. She lifted her glass, the drink cold in her hand, and forced a small nod. Charlotte's speech ended. Applause swelled. Napkins folded and unfolded. Cell phones lit up. Speeches and laughter resumed. But Margaret's grip tightened on her glass. Her skin tingled with something hotter than hurt. She drank the champagne not out of pleasure, but to swallow that silent humiliation into her chest where it belonged. The music swelled again. Guests moved toward the dance floor. Servers passed trays of hors d'oeuvres. Laughter rose and fell like wind on the lake, and still. No Edward, no signal of acknowledgement beyond the masked applause. Margaret felt splintered between grief and calm decision, between fading light and approaching night. A few minutes later, Charlotte nodded at the server. A tray with 2 glasses of champagne was lifted toward her. She picked one up and turned to clap toward the performers. It was then that the music stuttered. The pianist paused mid-note. Conversations trailed off, and in the sudden hush, the front door opened. Edward walked in. No fanfare, no announcement, just presence. He wore a dark suit and a grave expression, eyes scanning the room quickly before landing on Charlotte. He made his way to center stage with steady steps. Charlotte let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Edward raised a glass in Charlotte's direction, but then turned and raised it toward Margaret, who sat below the dais. The crowd fell further silent. Edward cleared his throat. "Good evening." He turned to Charlotte. "Thank you for your speech." Charlotte nodded, voice catching. "Thank you, Chair," but Edward raised his hand. "I would like to ask a guest to say a few words." He gestured toward Margaret. A murmur of shock spread across the tables. Margaret felt every eye on her, some curious, some scandalized. She inhaled softly. Edward didn't offer her the microphone. He simply gestured. She stood slowly and walked to the stage. Each step felt orchestrated by truth, not nerves. When she reached the microphone, she paused, looking at Charlotte for a moment, then out at the crowd. Her voice was calm, even. "I was invited tonight as a donor's mother." A gentle laugh rippled around the crowd. She let it settle before continuing. "I understood what that meant. No gratitude, no acknowledgement, just a role." Half the room shifted in their seats. "But," she said, lifting her glass, "when Edward requested I speak, I realized what I deserved was not applause." The room was quieter. Just before tears blurred her vision, she spoke clear. "I deserve recognition, not as a footnote, not as an emotional prop, not as an accessory to elegance." Pausing, she locked eyes with her son. "You promised years ago that you'd care for me. You never broke that promise. I just stopped believing you meant it." A sharp intake of breath drifted through the room. But tonight, Edward reminded us all that the integrity of ownership is held not just in deeds, but in honor. "So I will stand here where I belong, not in the background." She raised her glass. "To truth, to ownership, and to the love of a mother always unforgotten." Silence hung heavy. Then Edward lifted his glass, echoing the toast. Slowly, glasses clinked, first tentative, then sincere. The room shifted. Charlotte's face at first burned, then crumpled. Margaret returned to her seat, her hands steady. She hadn't asked for applause. She needed only presence, only truth. Edward had shown her that. The air changed in the room after that moment. The next toast came from Charlotte's father. His voice measured, his wording awkward, but he mentioned Margaret's name clearly, not as former housekeeper or honorary guest, but as the groom's mother, a phrase as powerful as any declaration. Margaret watched Charlotte silently critique her expression, first surprise, then regret, edging into something like fear. Dinner resumed, conversation resumed, but now it carried a different tone. Margaret didn't feel invisible. She felt anchored. No one at that table forgot her again. The clinking of glasses had barely faded when Edward took another step forward. The silence in the room remained thick, not the stunned silence of offense, but the captivated kind, when something unexpected still hangs in the air, waiting to fully land. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I've spent my life," Edward began, "investing not just in ideas or institutions, but in people." A few guests nodded, familiar with his philanthropic statements, but the tone of his voice was different, firmer, deliberate, almost intimate. He glanced briefly toward Charlotte, then to Margaret before addressing the room again. "Tonight I sat quietly and listened. I watched the way power cloaks itself in politeness. I watched how easily someone's name could be buried under a title they didn't choose." Charlotte shifted in her seat. Her smile tightened like a thread pulled too far. Edward went on, "Let me say this plainly. No one in this room, no matter how polished or pedigreed, has the right to use another person as decoration, emotional, social, or otherwise." The weight of his words fell like velvet and thunder. He turned slowly and looked directly at Margaret. "I came tonight not for speeches, not for ribbon cutting, and certainly not for photo opportunities. I came because someone I've respected for decades, quietly from afar, showed me what dignity looks like when the world tries to erase it." A soft inhale traveled through the room. He turned back to the guests. "You want to know who I admire tonight? Who I choose to invest in? Not just financially, but in principle?" He paused. A single heartbeat stretched the silence taut. "It's not anyone in this house." The sentence hit like a dropped glass. You could almost hear the shatter. Charlotte's expression fractured. Her hand gripped the stem of her glass. Matthew looked as if he'd stopped breathing altogether. Edward's voice didn't rise, but it cut deeper now, precise and without apology. "I have decided," he continued, "to withdraw my support from the Greystone Expansion Fund and from David's startup initiative." Audible gasps broke the quiet, a few murmurs. Someone's fork clinked against a plate. Charlotte stared at Edward, her lips slightly parted, unable to summon a response. Instead, Edward turned to Margaret. "In the past year, I learned that Margaret has quietly been helping a small community literacy project in the East Bay. No headlines, no endowments, just presence." Margaret blinked. "I'll be redirecting my grant," Edward announced, "to that project, and I hope, in doing so, to honor the kind of courage that doesn't need a spotlight to shine." The room erupted, not in confusion, but in applause. Not all clapped, of course. A few remained motionless, stunned or calculating, but the sound was undeniable. Charlotte lowered her glass slowly, her face frozen in the kind of practiced neutrality that barely masked the collapse inside. She tried to recover, turning to smile at a nearby guest, but her eyes were unfocused. Beside her, Matthew sat completely still. Whether in agreement, shame, or confusion, it wasn't clear. But he didn't reach for Charlotte's hand, not this time. Margaret, meanwhile, didn't cry. She didn't smile either. She simply met Edward's eyes and nodded once, because there was nothing performative about what had just happened. It wasn't revenge, it was recognition. Edward stepped down, walked quietly toward Margaret, and placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. Then he left the room. No more speeches, just truth. The atmosphere didn't return to its former glamour. The guests didn't resume with the same ease. Conversation turned toward what had just happened. The tone of the evening bent, shifted, and rearranged itself like light through fractured glass. Charlotte, ever the strategist, stood a few minutes later, feigned a tight-lipped toast of her own, thanking everyone for coming and praising unexpected generosity. But her voice betrayed her, thin, fragile, no longer in control. Afterward, a handful of guests made their way to Margaret, not to console, but to connect. A woman in her 40s leaned in. "That was the most honest thing I've seen at a party like this in years." A younger man added, You should have been on the program." Margaret nodded politely, accepting none of the praise as victory. This wasn't about winning, it was about no longer pretending. For the rest of the evening, she remained at her seat, gracious, steady. Charlotte never approached. Matthew hovered nearby once, then moved away when she didn't stand to greet him. The party ended not with a bang, but with a ripple. Guests left in smaller clusters. Conversation lingered on the driveway. One by one, cars pulled away into the dark, headlights slicing the trees. By the time Margaret walked back to her room, the lanterns had dimmed. She sat at the desk for a long time, the applause still faint in her ears. But it wasn't the clapping that echoed, it was Edward's words. "It's not anyone in this house." And somehow that sentence made her feel more seen than anything her son had said in a decade. The house was still. The echoes of crystal glasses, quiet gasps, and Edward's thunderous calm had faded into memory. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, a cup of lukewarm tea beside her, untouched. The night before had left her both exhausted and oddly cleansed. The weight she'd carried for so long, the silence, the erasure, had shifted. Not disappeared, but moved, like a boulder pushed just enough to let light through. She didn't expect more. She hadn't stayed up waiting for messages or apologies. There was no part of her that believed Matthew would call, or Charlotte would knock. The closure she received wasn't in words. It was in standing her ground, in reclaiming space. So when the first sleek car rolled into her gravel driveway, just as morning dew still clung to the grass, she thought perhaps someone was lost. Then came the second car, and a third, each one black, polished, gliding quietly into place like something choreographed. Margaret stepped to the window, heart tightening. This couldn't be. Before she could reach for her shawl, a soft knock sounded at the door. She opened it slowly. Edward stood there, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were several familiar faces. People from the reception, yes, but also others. Strangers, a woman in a tailored coat with a camera case slung over her shoulder, an older gentleman in a charcoal suit holding a wrapped basket, two younger women with soft smiles and thermoses in hand. Edward stepped forward. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, his voice gentle. She stared, unsure. "What is this?" Edward offered the faintest smile. "We thought we'd bring Thanksgiving to where it always should have been." He stepped aside to let the others in. Margaret blinked. The older man gave a respectful nod as he passed. "We hope it's not an imposition," Edward added. She began, voice catching. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't," he said simply. "Let us say it for you." The guests moved gently through her living room, setting covered trays on the counter, unpacking dishes with careful hands. Someone lit a cinnamon candle. Another replaced the tablecloth with one from their own bag, deep burgundy, embroidered with golden leaves. Margaret stood at the edge of her kitchen, watching the scene unfold like a dream. This was not pity. This wasn't spectacle. It was reverence. Edward came to her side again, voice low. "I meant what I said last night, and I wasn't the only one who noticed." Margaret swallowed. "I didn't expect this." "No," he said, "but you deserve it." An hour later, the table was full. The fire crackled in the hearth. The room smelled of roast vegetables, apple pie, and rosemary. Someone put on a soft jazz record from her collection without asking, just assuming she'd like it. They were right. Margaret sat at the head of her own table. Edward lifted a glass, this time without fanfare. "To those who've done the most when no one was looking," he said, voice soft. "To grace, in its quietest form." Glasses clinked. Margaret didn't toast. She smiled. And then, just as the first round of conversation and laughter settled, the man with the wrapped basket stood. "May I say something?" he asked. The room quieted. He looked at Margaret, his expression sincere. "You probably don't remember me. My name is Howard Langston. I'm here not as a guest of Edward's. I asked to come when I heard where he was going." Margaret's brow furrowed. "Langston?" Howard smiled. "About 15 years ago, my daughter was getting married. She'd saved for a beautiful dress. The morning of the wedding, the zipper broke. She was in tears. I drove around in a panic trying to find someone, anyone, to fix it. And I ended up at your front porch." Margaret blinked. "You were out in the garden. I barely got the words out before you ushered me inside, set the kettle on, and told me to bring the dress." You sewed it, stitched it by hand on your old machine, humming the whole time. The memory returned to Margaret slowly, like sun through fog. She walked down the aisle 10 minutes late, but radiant. Everyone thought it was planned, and you refused money. You just said, "Every bride deserves to feel perfect." The room was still. Howard continued, voice cracking slightly. She told me later that it changed the entire day for her. That moment, it saved it all. Margaret stared at him, overwhelmed. "I never forgot that," he said. "And when I saw your face last night, I realized I finally had a chance to say thank you." There were no words in her mouth, only warmth. The room burst into applause, not boisterous but genuine. This wasn't spectacle, it was truth. The last slice of pie had been passed, the laughter had softened into contented hums, and the candles were burning low when a knock came at the door. Margaret didn't move. Edward looked toward her. "Would you like me to—" She shook her head slowly. "No, I'll do it." She stood with the grace of someone who had lived long with quiet strength and walked to the door without hurry. On the porch stood David and Charlotte. She hadn't expected them, not after everything. David's eyes were red-rimmed. Charlotte, though composed as ever, had lost the sheen. Her tailored coat looked too stiff against the vulnerability in her eyes. "May we come in?" David asked. Margaret regarded them for a long moment, then stepped aside. They walked in slowly, Charlotte's heels tapping cautiously across the wood floor. They stopped just shy of the living room, where the remaining guests sat in quiet observation. Charlotte spoke first. "We owe you an apology," she said, voice thin. Margaret remained still. "You owe yourself a reckoning." David took a step forward. "Mom, I'm sorry for all of it. The way I let things happen, I didn't—" He broke off, trying again. "I didn't have the courage to stand up until it was too late." Charlotte glanced at him, then back to Margaret. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, "but I needed to say, I was wrong." Margaret's voice came calm and unwavering. "I'm not angry." Both of them blinked. "But I haven't forgotten." Charlotte lowered her eyes. Margaret stepped further into the room, her presence commanding without effort. "I raised a boy who once cried when his goldfish died, who ran home with a scraped knee and asked for 2 hugs because one wasn't enough. That boy disappeared, and a man came in his place who forgot that roots matter." David winced. "You've come now because things have shifted," Margaret continued. "Not because you heard me, but because the world finally did." Charlotte opened her mouth, then closed it. Margaret's gaze softened, but did not yield. "I don't hate you," she said, "but I won't pretend anymore. You're welcome in my house, but you'll enter as you are, not who you pretend to be." David nodded slowly. Understood. They turned to leave, but before the door closed, a phone buzzed. A few guests glanced down. Then Nancy's voice rose softly from the far side of the room. "Margaret," she said, holding up her phone, "it's done." Margaret tilted her head. Nancy walked forward, showing the screen. "The article's live. It's spreading fast." Charlotte froze. Nancy continued, reading aloud. "Exclusive. Development Council Board Member Charlotte Whitmore, implicated in pattern of strategic sabotage and signature forgery. Anonymous sources and internal documents reveal ethical violations." Charlotte's face drained of color. "I suggest you check your inbox," Nancy said coolly. "There's a formal notice of investigation. You'll be expected to step down by Monday." The room remained silent. David placed a hand on Charlotte's arm, but she shook it off. She turned back to Margaret. "You did this." "No," Margaret said quietly. "You did, I just stopped hiding it." Charlotte stood there, trembling not with rage, but exposure, and then, without another word, she walked out the door. David lingered a moment longer, his shoulders slumped. I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. Margaret nodded. "Then start by not breaking things further." He nodded, eyes glassy, and followed Charlotte into the night. Later, long after the last guest had left and the house had returned to its warm stillness, Margaret sat alone in the living room. The fire was aglow now, soft and slow. She sipped the last of her tea, the quiet a comforting old friend. Her eyes drifted upward to the wall above the mantel. There hung a photo, framed simply untouched by time. It showed a younger Margaret, her arms wrapped around a small boy. David, maybe 6, grinning with his missing front tooth, holding a paper crown he made in school. Her eyes in the photo were bright. Her smile was full. She looked at it for a long time. Then she smiled, not with regret, not with nostalgia, but with peace. "You were small once," she whispered to the photo, "held safe in my arms." She rose, steady and sure, and tonight I held myself.